Commissioner Engels, thank you so much for being with us today. I would love to dive into not only your work, but your experience of being a young person and interacting with the housing crisis, how you view it, connecting with the climate crisis, and
Mhm.
what legislative progress we've seen and what more that we could be doing. So why don't we start? Because how old are you?
I'm 20.
20. Okay, yeah, I'm 21. We're both young people in Connecticut, and the looking at the housing on the market in Westbrook, where you're from, and Norwalk, where I'm from, I'm sure it's a little bit dispiriting with the costs that you're looking at. I'd love to hear you talk about how you as a young person experience the housing market, like look at the housing market, dread the housing market, and then how that informs your politics and why you wanted to be involved in all of this.
Yeah, of course. So obviously, I think the big thing is affordability. I know me personally, I'd love to return back to my home state and be able to live here, work here. But the biggest obstacle to that is the cost. So it really holds back, where I can live, what type of housing I can live in. And so it really inspires my work, trying to get more affordable housing, especially into shoreline communities like my own that are historically expensive. But yeah, I'm really motivated by my own stature as a young person to hopefully get some more affordable options into the market.
Definitely. Let's dive a little bit into Westbrook. Can you tell me about what the municipality looks like, and then maybe some hyper local issues that have to
Yeah.
do with the housing crisis? Like, are there pushes for certain housing creation that have been slowed down? Is affordability a rising issue in the local discourse? How is that all playing out in Westbrook specifically?
Yeah, of course. So Westbrook is a small little town right on the shoreline. It's about 7,000 people. I think we have two pretty, I guess not unique, but common problems with housing. First off, our housing stock is about 80% single family. So there isn't a lot of different options, affordable options for especially young people or seniors or people looking to start a family. We need more apartments. We need more just multifamily houses. And then also going along that is the cost. It's obviously being by the water is more expensive than the state average. So that going in hand with the lack of housing diversity is really an issue here in Westbrook.
Yeah, so Westbrook, you're saying it's 80% single family homes. It has
Yeah,
a train station, which is
it
pretty
does.
unique for a community that size in America, let alone and in Connecticut, let alone America.
Absolutely.
So talk to me about transit oriented communities and a pattern of development that centers things like train stations. How would that impact Westbrook?
Yeah, that would be a huge a thing for our community. Our train station is located right in our town center. So it'd be great if we can build mixed use development, residential development around that area and kind of unlock the real economic potential that our downtown has. It'd be great if we could do that.
Absolutely. And there's a bunch of sort of surrounding reform that goes along with building housing near transit. There's, parking reform. I'd love to hear
Right.
your take on parking reform and how that plays into walkable environments and the ability for us to build a diversity of housing options.
Yeah, of course. Parking reform, or the current way parking is regulated, is with maximums or minimums. And I think the current minimums that are in place really restrict the diversity of housing or diversity of development that can go into certain areas. I think towns like our own are taking better steps to allow for shared parking, and then obviously restrict or lowering the amount of or parking that is necessary for certain types of development, which I think is great. But obviously, we need to do more to allow for more diverse types of housing, types of development in certain areas. And I think parking reform is a really good way to do that.
Yeah, and we actually have seen a decent bit of action from municipalities in terms of
Mhm.
parking reform in recent years, and we also saw some parking reform at the state level with HB 8002. Why is it, do you think, that there's so much backlash to this kind of change because, you look at localities that are making a lot of this difference. You look at, across the country, you have Republican, Democratic, and what we call purple states, taking necessary steps for things like parking reform and things like housing reform. Why do you think it's become such a hot button issue in Connecticut with so much pushback in terms of, talking about the character of neighborhoods, local control? Can you sort of break that down of the discourse and the pushback, and then why you still believe in these causes?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the big overarching idea is that Connecticut does have a lot of these small towns, and obviously you see a lot of discourse in those small towns related to keeping the character or keeping the small town feel is what we get a lot in Westbrook, which I guess is understandable from some point of view, but that's typically just the way to resist the development. There's usually not much of content behind that claim. I would argue that I think fighting the development is losing the small town feel. Your neighbors aren't going to be able to afford to live there. The people that grew up there aren't going to be able to, afford to live there. So I think, trying to get rid of the development in the name of the small town feel or the character is really doing the opposite of what people intend. Which I guess people, they don't understand exactly what they're actually arguing for sometimes, but it's doing the opposite sometimes is what I see.
Yeah, let's dig into that a little bit more with this idea of change, because often it is said that people fear change, and reform often is change. But lack of reform, lack of action on the issue also perpetuates change, like you're talking about with the idea of not being able to afford the place that you grew up. That invites then a different group of people to live there, and that is change. So talk to me a little bit about how you are talking to people who are in opposition and sort of telling them your story and telling them the stories of other people who are struggling to afford to live. And I guess just reckoning with this idea of change.
Yeah, of course. That was a big thing that I talked about when I was campaigning, is that I talked to a lot of older neighbors, especially, and people who had been in the community for a long time. And they were certainly upset at the idea of, reforming and making the community more affordable, because they've been here forever, and they think that this reform is just going to welcome in a new wave of people that they, weren't comfortable with. So I simply said the exact same thing that I just said to you earlier, is that a lack of reform here is doing the exact same thing that they don't like. The people that grew up here can't afford to come back, and your neighbors that have been living here are being pushed out because of the lack of change and the lack of reform that's making it less affordable.
Right. Yeah. So if there was reform implemented to the extent that you want to see, things on parking and different forms of housing, whether it be, duplexes or apartments and mixed use and all these words that we use to describe the world that we want to see for our, municipalities in the state of Connecticut. I'm curious how you think our daily lives are different. So, for example, if I'm walking down the street in Westbrook, in the downtown sort of area near the train station, there's perhaps some commercial, there's some residential. What am I seeing as I'm walking down the street? How is it different from what currently exists?
Yeah, of course. My vision ultimately is to be a lot less car centric. I think that's a big theme of transit oriented development as well. I'd love to see, a combination of restaurants, small businesses, open space, and I think mixed use and residential properties all coming together to form a vibrant and people-centric destination rather than the current reality.
Yeah, and we've taken some steps forward. So as we lightly touched on HB 8002, I'd be curious to know how that bill aligns with those goals in terms of the parking reform, in terms of the transit-oriented communities. Just talk to me about how you think that bill could impact your community and impact the state of Connecticut.
Yeah, of course. So I think the one of the biggest things that I think will help communities like Westbrook, as I think the state funding and the greater state capacity.
Hmm.
I think towns like our own will really need that technical assistance and that financial assistance with some infrastructure projects that will need to support the larger developments. In our own community, we're seeing that our town center will need an upgraded septic to be able to handle more economic development and more businesses coming in. So we think that hopefully more state funding and greater state capacity could be able to help us upgrade that infrastructure, and then we'll be able to support those mixed use and larger residential developments.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, when you look at things like the Council on Housing Development getting, public agencies and authorities communicating with one another,
Yeah.
there's so much that can be done with an efficient government that has the real capacity to deliver for municipalities to make it so people's tax dollars, show up and come back around to their
Yeah.
communities
Yeah.
with vital projects like you just talked about. Um, I'd be curious to know how you think this is all intersecting with the climate crisis, because when you look at the fact that transportation results in a significant portion of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, and we're talking about transit-oriented communities, right? Orienting the community around a train station or bus hub or things like this, and this is the way we used to develop, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
How is that a solution to the climate crisis? Walk me through sort of where those issues overlap.
Yeah, of course, and I absolutely agree that it's a amazing solution to the climate crisis. I think the big thing is taking the emphasis off of cars, so creating more walkable communities and really embracing public transportation. We're lucky enough to have that train station, so enabling people to come and go from New Haven or New London to go to New York City. I think really emphasizing public transportation and making it so people are more comfortable to walk, to bike, to do anything like that instead of taking their car everywhere is obviously a great solution.
Yeah, definitely. And I'd be curious to know what's happening at the local level. You're a zoning commissioner. You're working on these things. You're seeing the state developments, encouraged by them. You alluded towards the idea that Westbrook had been taking steps as well on their own, because of course we want municipalities taking the liberty of doing things themselves if they want to. So what has been the work there?
Yeah, so I think one great thing that we did recently is the Board of Selectmen recently joined the Connecticut Municipal Development Authority. So tying back in with economic development, we hope that hopefully that type of authority can help us with funding with the town center and hopefully support infrastructure projects like the town center septic. And hopefully that can, upgrade our infrastructure so that we're ultimately able to support these larger developments.
Yeah, and what more would you like to see out of your municipality and your state? Are there any things on the horizon that you're looking at, and in light of HB 8002 and the partnering with the joining of CMDA, future steps in the I guess in 2026 or in 2027 that you're looking at and considering?
No, obviously, I'm super glad that the state was able to get all these partners together and pass 8002, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how municipalities can buy in. Because as we're seeing right now, there's a lot of pushback from local, zoning planning commissions. So I think the biggest thing that we have to do is really just work with these local boards and commissions to buy into this. This bill is here to help communities grow. It's not forcing anything upon them. It's partnering with them. So I think having these conversations and talking to each other is the best way to go about it. And I'm looking forward to seeing if the state and local governments can collaborate even further on projects like this.
Absolutely. What do you say to any young person watching who looks at their community and worries about the affordability of it, or looks at politics and is and feels relatively cynical about it, feels like that their government is incapable of delivering for them. To like speak to that cynicism, because I'm sure you looked up at one point and were like, my government is not doing what it should on issues that I care about, but you ran towards the fire instead of running away from it. And so I'd be curious to know what in your head made it so that you wanted to get involved, and what you'd recommend to other people who are feeling the stress of an affordability crisis and a housing crisis, and that look at the system and say, this is not worth fixing, or this is unable to be fixed. Why get involved? Why care?
Yeah, of course. I initially got involved a couple of years ago when I was 18 with my town's Inland Wetlands and Watercourses Commission, which is also another land use commission. So I saw older people, sometimes people that were 2 to 3 times my age, making these important decisions about the environment that I knew would impact my generation the most. So I saw a vacancy on the commission. I jumped on, and then immediately tried to kind of make my presence known. And then from there, I moved up to the Zoning Commission, and I'm looking to working with my town even further to try and be a voice for those young people.
So you had to get elected for your current Zoning Commission position. Is that correct? It's an elected body?
Yes.
So what is that campaigning like of talking to people? Because I'm sure you get a lot as a young person, like, oh, you have to live a little bit longer. Like, you got to get some gray hairs before you are able to talk on these issues and decide them for us. As you were just saying, there were people who are 40 years, older than you, who are like, I've lived here all my life. Like, what are you? You're barely an adult. Like, you started driving a few years ago. You're fresh out of like high school. What are you doing trying to govern me?
Yeah.
How do you talk to them and level with them and talk about, I've got a lot to learn, but I feel strongly about these issues, and sort of make that connection, and get to where you are.
Yeah, of course. So I think the big thing is just having conversations with people, especially just having, honest, regular, everyday conversations with their constituents, opening up, lines of communication, reaching out to them. I think it's so important. People just need to be heard. They don't want to be lectured to. So I think that's a big thing as well. But also you will, find that once you're on these boards and commissions, sometimes people will kind of look at you, other commissioners, because you're younger, and kind of, dismiss you just because you don't have the same experiences as them. But I think it's important to really assert yourself, dig into those regulations, know what you're talking about, and I think eventually you'll make your presence known and people will listen to you.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's important, right? Not everyone should have the same experiences on these boards and commissions and localities, because it's often the people with the time who are able to serve, and that makes it so it skews wealthier and it skews older. And there's nothing wrong with anybody wanting to get involved, and so a diversity of perspectives is certainly necessary.
Absolutely.
Brian, thank you so much for talking to me today, and I look forward to continuing to follow your work.
Of course. Thanks for the invite. It was great to talk to you.
Appreciate it.